A woman sentenced to life in prison for the killing of the father of her child in Minot in 2022 is appealing her conviction to the state Supreme Court. A jury convicted 26-year-old Heather Hoffman in September in the April 2022 shooting death of 22-year-old Alex Eckert at his Northwest Minot apartment. Prosecutors said Hoffman convinced an acquaintance to drive her to Eckert's apartment the night of the shooting, where she confronted him in an ongoing child custody dispute. Last month, Judge Gary Lee sentenced Hoffman to life without the chance of parole at an emotional sentence hearing that saw Eckert's parents testify for more than an hour. When given the chance to address the court, Hoffman maintained her innocence, and her attorney, Stephen Moninger, told the courts his client intended to appeal. Dates for oral arguments are not set yet.